Hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel discussion for the third film in our eighth annual African American Film Series. I'm Essence Wilson with Communities First, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. We are really excited today to hear from two panelists who are going to highlight some of the important takeaways from the film. Communities First started this film series to educate, inspire, and entertain audiences through independent or small budget films that feature African American filmmakers, artists, and subjects of interest to our community. If you weren't there on Thursday, you certainly missed a great event full of fun, food, music, and fellowship. But hopefully, you can join us for our final event in February. If you did happen to miss the film, no worries at all. You can see it on the website www.aplacecalleddesire.com. So, a Place Called Desire is a documentary about a nearly forgotten community located in the Upper Ninth Ward of New Orleans called Desire. In 1909, the land was a landfill for industrial and residential waste, but by 1949, the land was authorized for new construction. The new homes were specifically marketed towards African Americans, and in the time that they were there, they were exposed to some uh, challenging living conditions, in some instances, hazardous and toxic waste. But there are also some amazing people who lived in Desire, and their stories were so well highlighted by filmmaker Leonard Smith III. So today you'll have an opportunity to hear from him and also from Mona Eunice, who is the executive director of Environmental Transformation Movement of Flint. So let's go ahead and start with some brief introductions, and I'll ask Mona if you could introduce yourself first.
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me be part of this important discussion today. My name is Mona Monroe Eunice, and I'm with the Environmental Transformation Movement of Flint, which is an environmental justice organization here in Flint, Michigan. We cover a broad range of environmental justice issues, both to address like fights that need to happen on the ground right now, but also proactive planning for a healthier future. My background's in community engagement, academically and on the ground in environmental justice, partnership work. That's what I bring to Flint. It's my home. I'm raising my child here. And I really enjoyed watching the film. So I'm really excited to be part of this panel today. Thank you.
And thank you for being so willing to join us and for the work that you're doing every day for residents of our city. And Leonard Smith, thank you for being here with us. I have to laugh because when I contacted you about showing the film and you found out that we were doing a panel, the first thing that you said to me was, "You're not doing a panel if I'm not a part of it. You will not be talking about my film, my city, my people without me there." And I think that that is tremendous because so often we see the films and we hear the part of the story that could be told, but we know that there's so much more that could be said, right? That you can't quite make into that hour and a half. So we're glad that you're here. And if you could introduce yourself and then tell us how you got started in this business. You have an interesting story and an interesting journey to becoming a filmmaker.
Well, thanks for having me. My name is Leonard Smith III. I am the president and founder of LS3 Studios, a company that I started in 2008, 2 years before I actually got laid off out of corporate America. And so it was one of those things that I decided to step out on faith and start my own company. My previous background, I was an engineer. I did biomedical engineering and worked in fiber optics and also in implementation, but decided that I will step out on faith and decide I want to do something that I enjoy doing. And so that was filmmaking. And so I love telling our stories. I think they need to be told. And I hope more people get involved with telling their community stories, their personal stories, their family stories, because it's important. You know, the last thing you want is those stories to end up in the cemetery.
Absolutely, or sometimes even worse, someone else telling the story and telling it with a skewed perspective or a negative outlook, and it's not the truth about what happened, and it's not the truth about the wonderful people that live in cities all around the country. So, can you tell us why was this an important film for you to create?
Well, of course, it was a personal story. It is actually my story. I grew up in Desire, was there since 1964, but had relatives there as well. My grandmother lived around the corner from us. They had been there since 54. And so that was way before the housing development was there, and it was just the houses. But um, you know, growing up in the community, I was heavily involved in, you know, everything that went on there. I played sports there, went to church there, went to school there, and realized that, you know, that was my story. And so I decided to, and I've always liked interviewing older people. I don't know where that came from, but I love sitting down and talking to old folks, sitting under the tree in the backyard or whatever. And so I decided to start interviewing people about what they thought about the community, and, you know, what were their thoughts and what they remember growing up in the community, and, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because we did mention that in the documentary. And so I found that there were so many great stories that I didn't even know myself. So when you start interviewing people, you realize that there are stories that need to be told. And I guess my goal was to put the camera in front of people who probably would not have ever been interviewed, or ever anyone even talked to them about, you know, what was like growing up in this community. And so they became storytellers in their own right. I mean, Mr. Cavalier, and of course, Mr. Queer, and, you know, just thinking about those people that, you know, have gone on, but their stories were just so fantastic that I felt that it was a need to let the world see. So this was a 12-year project, and I'm glad I finally finished it.
What a story. And I think, you know, those opportunities for transitions in careers lead us to sometimes the best opportunities, right? And so I have a similar story of being laid off from General Motors. And if I hadn't had that happen, I was a third generation GM employee. Then I
Mm-hmm.
probably would have never come to do the work that I'm doing at Communities First, at least not full time, for
That's
sure.
right.
And it's been so rewarding and so fulfilling. And I mean, I always say, like, I still get to use those skills on a day to day basis. So no experience is wasted. Our lives are cumulative.
That's true.
Yeah. So Mona, as you watched the film, you know, kind of as an outsider to that community, what were some of the things that resonated with you, or some of the moments in the film that really stuck out and will stick with you?
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me was the importance of narrative change, and I think we feel this in Flint, and we've, you know, it was, I think, something that came through all the stories from community members in Desire, that what is portrayed in the media is not necessarily how people would describe their own home, their
Mm-hmm.
own community. And I think that that's that's very relevant here in Flint as well, because if you're in Out County and don't really have experiences here, your vision of the community is very much shaped um, by the media, but not your own lived experience. So I think telling the stories is so important. Oral histories are um, so essential for preserving the history of a community. And one of the other things that really stood out to me is how many people talked about, you know, there was a quote, Desire provided a strong sense of community and fellowship. And you see that in Flint neighborhoods as well, including ones that have had environmental contamination, or ones like the St. John Street neighborhood, which were destroyed for urban renewal. You know, you had this diaspora of families
Mm-hmm.
because of the environmental conditions, or losing their homes because of decisions made um, from the outside. And but when people talk about their community, they talk about the strong sense of the communal village, right, raising them, and that came through very strongly in the film, um, in so many different ways. And just, it was really profound to hear how many people just had this amazing upbringing, you know, what a tight knit community there was in Desire, and probably still is, in, you know, within those who are living there. Um, the other thing that really stood out to me was the issue of legacy pollution, and
Mm-hmm.
how landscapes change over time, but that history is often forgotten, and the need to um, remember what we've done to our landscape, so that we can make sure that we're setting people up for success
Mm-hmm.
and healthy lives, because there are generational impacts to that, obviously. Um, if you can't plant your garden safely, grow your own food safely, um, But I think the stories were, it was just really great to, you could see that people were picturing their lives as they were telling their stories.
I've always been told that if you give the pen to someone else to write your story, then it's not your story anymore. And I find that happens a lot with, African American communities, people of color. I also believed in that African proverb that talks about the lion. If he had his own historian, then the stories that the hunter had won't be quite the same. And so, we have to make sure that we tell our stories. And the goal was to get the story told from within, and then let it go out, as opposed to somebody coming from the outside coming in and telling us how we lived.
I think that's a really great point. And if you were to go and look at what the news has said about Flint, Michigan, right, or Detroit, or Saginaw, it just does not match and align with the experiences of the people that live there. And I would think similarly for Desire. I did a Google search, and there were all kinds of articles, and
Yes.
there was one source, and I won't tell people where it is because I don't want you to go look at it, because but it just seemed to outline one negative thing after another,
Yes.
and the narrative was almost as though it was something that the people who lived there had done versus something that had been done to them,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
which I thought was really interesting. And I would say somewhat similar for Flint, right? There are certain things that happen. And as we think about structural racism, we think about environmental justice, there's some underlying things that cause conditions to come about,
Mm-hmm.
right, that are not the most beneficial to the residents that live there. So I think, this is a good opportunity for us to unpack that a little bit, because, these issues aren't new, the issues of structural racism, environmental justice. And so just curious, what are some examples of those things that we should just be aware of, that might be happening around the country? So we kind of know a little bit about these two stories about Flint and about Desire, but where else is this happening so we don't feel like it's just us?
Do you want me to go first on this one, or would you like to?
Well, when you do your research, you just find that, there's other pockets of things that are happening around the country. Even case in point, the interstates being run between in communities, that can completely just tear a community up. That happened in New Orleans, in the Treme area, one of the oldest African American communities in the country. And they put Interstate 10 down the middle. They tore up oak trees. At one time it was, you couldn't, it took an act of Congress to tear down an oak tree, but they tore down miles of oak trees to put an interstate. And so those are the things that you see around the country, because as you read, Desire was not the only one. Treme wasn't the only one that actually had an interstate run through the middle of a neighborhood. And so as time go on, people forget those stories to say, oh yeah, we used to have a picnic under the oak tree on Claiborne Avenue. They don't remember that anymore because it's the interstate. And so there's been talk of getting rid of the interstate, but then now cross country is in many cities, large cities especially. Atlanta has that problem. I remember when I lived in Atlanta and they tore down that community, very established community, to put the stadium in there. So it's urban renewal, what it was called back in the day. But the bottom line is that they're destroying neighborhoods where people grew up and had families live there, and it was generational stuff that people lived, like in Desire. It was always a if you were there, your grandparents were there, your great grandparents, if you had them, and then the children would come along and they decide, well, I want to stay nearby, for convenience or whatever, but they did stay in that community. And so we don't have those options anymore because a lot of the communities have been torn up for various reasons.
Yeah, I would add that if we're going to address environmental injustice, you have to address all forms of racism and structural racism, because it's all intertwined. And I think, just with the film, and this kind of overlaps like the narrative change plus root issues, the story about the Black Panthers And in the community, they're providing social services, they're providing spaces of community empowerment. But the narrative is that they're destructive because they're asserting their power as as human beings, right? And so really what the government was doing was squashing any sense of empowerment and personal agency. And that's also why it's so important to tell our own stories. But another thing is that you have environmental justice activists all over the country using their agency to address things like historic redlining, which have, you can see the changes on the landscape for where banks have invested or where cities have divested based on where people of color have lived. You have zoning issues, which zoning is a huge mechanism for either undoing racism or reinforcing it. And so that comes out clearly with the film where, houses are built on a landfill. If you have good zoning, that would never have happened. And you would never place a landfill next to people. And if a landfill is used to burn garbage for any period of time, you don't want any of that air pollution coming near families, and you don't want it migrating through the air into onto their yards and their soils where children play. So I think it's really important. It sounds so dull, I think, when people think of zoning, and it's basically the set of rules for land use and what you can do in different spaces. But it can be used in the right ways. And I'm really excited that Flint has a new zoning code. It's taken a lot of years in advocacy. It moves us closer to having, ways of operating that lift up social justice. And the other thing that you see across the country with environmental justice are sacrifice zones. And it ties into all, the conversation about zoning, where government agencies and the people using their positions of power in government agencies are writing off communities. And environmental injustice aligns there's studies of this, meta studies that look all across the country. And where cases of environmental justice happen are almost always in, Black and brown communities. Secondarily, it's by income, but first is by race. And so if we're going to transform, like this, if we're going to push this environmental justice movement across the country, we have to be talking about new policy making around things like cumulative impacts, not having concentrated pollution in communities of color, almost always in Black neighborhoods, and so I think, I would say the other thing is just being able to deal with legacy pollution. And the class action lawsuit, there was it was connected to Superfund, as I understand, in Desire. Now the Superfund program at the federal level is defunct, and so there isn't that mechanism in existence to help communities that have this legacy pollution be able to clean it up. So there's a lot of parallels I felt between Desire and Flint and environmental justice communities all over the country.
I think all great points, and I just want to go back to something that you said, Leonard, about the interstates. We are actively in Flint having a conversation about one of those cross city interstates that I-475 that tore through a strong African American community, and there are a group of those residents that are still meeting. Right, they're still together in very powerful ways. And there was actually, and I'm going to drop the link here at some point. There was a oral history project that was done with some of the individuals from that neighborhood. As we're working with the Michigan Department of Transportation to re-envision what that area and the adjacent area and the I-475 can look like. So I think we've seen that in other communities where the conversation got started, and sometimes the actual addressing of those underlying issues and actual change maybe did not manifest. So we're hopeful and optimistic, but at the same time, we realize that this isn't a new conversation, right?
That's right.
It's been had in many, many, many communities, but I think we just have to be advocates, right? That the dollars actually come through and that the plan matches what community is desirous of, so that we can hopefully repair and undo some of the harm that was done. We'll never undo it all, obviously, right? But I think there's some opportunities there. So we've talked a little bit about desire, but some people, if they haven't seen the film, they may not know what that community was like. So I'll start by saying that we're talking about essentially a public housing project that was built in the city, and that there were 13,000 residents living in about 1,860 units. From the pictures that I saw, they all looked like two-story buildings with like 14 to 16 units in them. And in theory, brand new housing, it should be a beautiful, nice, vibrant area. And from someone who lived there, I want to hear, what was it like, right, on a personal level, and then what was it like as you think about what it should have been and could have been, right, and what it actually was. And I think working in what the people were like and the family, and we just want to know, right, from your perspective.
Well, again, it gets back to many of those units were generational, because you would have people that, oh, my grandmother got this unit first, and then the next generation got it, and then the next generation. But from the beginning, Desire was not built like the regular housing developments that was in the city. It was the only one that was not built completely with brick. It actually had a lot of wood. Now let's think about that. We talk in Louisiana in a swamp, because it was built on a swamp, and we have termites every year for the most part. And so it was a matter of months when they started seeing some deterioration of the buildings as they were putting them up, because this was all wood. And it wasn't the best of wood. It wasn't like cypress. It was like oak, pine or something. It was like pine. And so the termites had a field day. And so now you're talking, the structure was built out of pine. And so you now had shifting of buildings. And then, of course, plumbing becomes an issue. So when you get to a point where you're supposed to be maintaining all of this and you can't because there's so many units, then you started having problems. And looking at old newspaper articles, many of the residents, they formed committees where they would say, we need you all to come and check this out. This is the problem we having. And a lot of times it was ignored. Other times it was just patched up kind of thing. And so, Desire was kind of like set to be a failure from the beginning because of that. It was the only one that was actually 2 stories. And you pointed that out. I'm like, okay, she was really paying attention, because the other housing developments had 3 stories, but Desire was the only one that, if you saw pictures of the housing developments in New Orleans, you can tell Desire because it was 2-story. But it was the largest one. To give you an example, at one time there was 13,000 residents in Desire, and it was 10,000 children. So can you imagine? And we only had one playground. Sampson Park was the only playground on Louisa Street. So you almost had to take a number to even get on a swing kind of thing. It was one of those types of things. But, as time went on, they built another park, but then they closed it. It was named Herman Penn after the first guy who was actually killed in Vietnam War, who was from the community, who actually went to Culver High School as well, my high school. But it was from the beginning, in the Louisa Street homes, which was built long before, and I would say 10 years before the project was built. Again, that was not expensive construction as well. They were built on pollards because, we do know that New Orleans is below sea level. And when Hurricane Betsy came in 1965, even with them sitting on 4-foot pollards, we had 2 feet of water in our house. And so, Katrina just wiped out the whole community, but Betsy had done its damage too back in 65. But it was the Desire was just not built to last, I should say. And what they did after Katrina, every housing development kept one unit that kind of represent what the community was like or what the buildings were like. And they couldn't do it for Desire because the termites had taken over, and between the termites and Katrina, they could not save one of the units to have like a replica of what it used to look like. So they just was not built to last over, and it was surprised they lasted as long as they did.
And then what do you remember about your time growing up there? So we have an idea of the construction and, the one playground for 10,000 children, but just kind of what was your personal experience growing up?
Well, like we lived in the housing development. Actually, we lived in the houses that was built by the Pittman Construction Company, and so these were hundreds of homes. And then Louisa Street was the main street that divided, I guess, from the housing development. Because before the housing development, there were houses there that they tore down in order to build the housing development. But it was a place to play. I mean, they had, when they built the housing development, they had a community center. And that was kind of like the heartbeat of the community. There was always events, it would be fashion shows and talent shows, and even had a midnight basketball league that I played in. But it was a place to be. Anything you want to, you can learn how to sew, how to dance, karate, you name it. They had it at the Desire community. And so when the Desire community started deteriorating and people started moving out, because the Hope 6 grant came about. And Hope 6 grant was to basically tear down all of the housing developments as we know it to this day. And so they had mixed, I guess they call them mixed income communities. And that's what we have there now. But it's not quite I guess, the homely feeling that you had when you were growing up. A lot of the people that live there now are not original people from Desire. So you don't have that generational warmth of, this is where we grew up at, this is our family home and stuff. You have people from all parts of the city. But when Desire was first built, that's what happened. People migrated. I've read letters from in the library that mentioned how people begged to move in Desire that was living in other developments around the city, a lot of locations. But Desire was a desired place to be at that time when it first opened. And it was actually beautiful. It had a nice landscape. They had landscaped everything, trees and all of that. But as time went on, if you don't do the maintenance, then that's what happens. It deteriorates, and it deteriorated at a rapid rate. It didn't last too long. But in spite of that, you had family units that was there, and everybody was so tied to each other. Because again, when one family moved in, the next family generation come over, and the next thing you know, you got 3 and 4 generations in the same community, and it was convenient to walk to grandmother's house or something like that.
And I think that's a beautiful thing as you contrast it with like the challenges and then this rich like family and community environment. And, I think we could say the same thing here, right? There's challenges, but so many wonderful people doing wonderful things and, great opportunities that exist, right? So like there's this duality of the story, right? And I do think it's just important to kind of note that, when you said that it was almost set up to be a failure from the beginning, as I was reading and doing a little bit of research, it seemed like, based on the map that I was looking at, that it was almost like a one way in, one way out sort of scenario, because it was bounded by the railroad tracks and the river. Yeah. And so there was like one kind of entry exit point. And we've seen that with at least one housing development that I'm thinking of in Flint, where, to access it, you've got one road, and it's almost like, I don't want to, it's like you're contained in a space, right? There's not the freedom to move about and to, have multiple points of entry and exit. And then you think about the core construction. I was reading about some of the housing units were built not on concrete, right, but just right directly on the dirt. And so, that's just, it doesn't seem like like something
Right.
that was set up for success. And then having one playground with 10,000 children, I think everybody can agree, right, that that probably wasn't the best idea. And I think there was like a shortage of schools and a need for additional school. And you know um I think there was a need for a church building, and
Mhm.
just kind of some of those amenities that where there wasn't a whole lot of forethought about some of the things that people would need to have the amenities necessary for community, right?
Well,
So,
it was amazing when I interviewed Misty Queer, and she talked about that they prayed and prayed for a school, and then the other part of that is that they had the foresight. Let's vote somebody in. So let's have a campaign to get people to vote. And they went, soliciting people and bring them downtown to vote. And of course, they had the obstacle of trying to, being able to vote, register to vote. And they gave them a question like, when is your birthday and the exact date and month and all. I'm not even surprised they didn't even ask what time you were born, but it was those types of things that, was barriers. But in spite of that, they still survived and they did what they needed to do. And, and her thought process was, well, maybe we'll get somebody, if we vote, we'll get somebody in there who would actually help us to build a school. And I just thought that was so beautiful, for her. And, Mr. Queer was almost 100 years old when she died. Um, I think she made it, she was 99 and 6 months or 7 months or something like that. But the wisdom that came from her was just unreal, and she became a storyteller. I mean, I could interview her and sit there for hours and just talk because, it was just, again, getting back to, I love interviewing elders. And she just tell, such a great story about Desire and what it was like when she first got there, you know.
and Mona, I'll just allow you the opportunity to like respond to anything that was just said.
Yeah, I loved that part of the film as well, and I thought how strategic this woman was, to have the foresight to think, well, okay, how do we plan, like, we're here, we have this big project we want to have happen. All these children need education and a quality education. Let's start with voting rights. I thought that was brilliant.
Mhm.
But I think that also speaks to like the agency, right, of people and then really building the neighborhood themselves. And I think it was it a school or was it a church where they were offered a building and the residents had
The
to, it
church.
was a
Mhm.
church, right? And they had to like literally dismantle this other building and truck it into
Yes.
the community. And then like there were pictures of building out the frame and like the amount of work that went into creating the community, not just socially but like physically, on the residents was just really, I think it was very profound.
Well, that was the first building. They ended up getting two more for the school and then for a gym. And so, but for them to have the skill set, even if they didn't, like I know Mr. Cavalier was a carpenter, so he knew, and there was a Mr. Bivens, and there was a lot of the church members that had been, in trades and that type stuff, and so they were able to assemble and disassemble and put it back together again, But it was just amazing, again. And he talks about even that did make the film in the director's cut. He talks about how they put the bell tower up on that church, and what it took to do that. And that in itself, but it was a long part that I had to cut out. But it was just interesting to hear him and Father Dodd, got some of the local guys who would just happen to be in the neighborhood drinking wine and got them to come help put the bell tower on. So it was a lighthearted part, but it didn't make the cut. But it was just amazing to hear some of those stories that you always wonder, well, how did they get that up there? Because there was no cranes or anything like that they could afford to use, and so they just did the rope and pulled it up. But it was just, and I got a chance to even interview Father Dodd before he died. And so he sent a lot of those pictures from St. Philip, which was amazing. That was in his private collection. And so, when you started asking people about, well, what happened, then all of a sudden they can produce a picture of what they're talking about. that in itself was, that's golden for a filmmaker. And so I was looking for more. Didn't get as many as I wished I would have, but the ones that I got, I thought was able to really, portray what was really going on in the community.
And I'm sure that when the buildings were gifted to them, they felt like a gift. But then recognizing that they had to literally dismantle the buildings, transport them, and then rebuild the buildings. And it didn't sound like the distance was very far, but I can't recall how long they said it took for the church. Do you remember?
Yeah, it was a distance because that was in the Chalmette area. It may have been, if I just think about it, maybe about 6 or 7 miles that they had to track the buildings, and then disassemble and that type stuff. So um, I don't know if you remember the building, well, the streets scene that there was a car and there was somebody walking across the street. Well, that was the street that they had to use to come down, that muddy street. Because that was one of the things that people complained about early on, is that the taxi cabs would not come back there because the streets were so bad. So after a rain, you cannot get a taxi cab to come in Desire. They would actually stop on the other side of the track, and you'd have to walk the rest of the way. And so that was all part of living in Desire, because remember the part where they say that the residents had to pay $500 to have the streets paved. So for the most part, it was just mud and rocks and that type stuff until they got the and $500 in the 50s is not cheap. $500 now, if you think about it, is a lot. And so for people to have, I think they gave them installments, but that's beside the point. It was $500, and we still talking taxpayers. And I wanted to say that Desire has produced so many professional people. I mean, we got doctors that have come out of it, MDs, PhDs, attorneys. We've had engineers. We've had, you name it, every walk of life. We've had somebody, more than one, that has come out of that community, in spite of all what we had to go through. And that's another, I guess, a feather in the cap for a place called Desire, because people were driven, and that generation before us was always looking for that next generation to do better, and I think we did.
And as you talk about having, interviewed all of these people, and I think you said it was over the course of like 12 years, and you were collecting information and collecting video. And then I heard you mention that some of them have passed on since then. I think it's just a reminder to us, you don't get that opportunity to hear in a person's voice what happened. And I think so often, in communities of color, we don't tell those stories because they can be very painful. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just, another reminder, right, to have those conversations, to, pull out and we have the technology now, right?
Yes, we do.
You pull out your iPhone and sneakily, if you need to, right, record those, grandparents and great grandparents and things like that, to try and get a better sense of self and a sense of community from them. So I think that's just a friendly reminder that, we need to hear those stories. We need to know, right?
Well, let me, can I add to that, is that I had started that project before Katrina happened, because I had started interviewing people for other projects, and I just happened they were the same people from the community. And so during Katrina, I had 7 containers of film and footage and pictures that I had taken down the course of many years. And so when Katrina hit, of the 7, only 1 survived the storm, because I had 8 feet of water and 8-foot ceiling house. And so this one container, Rubbermaid container, was where this footage was for a place called Desire, and another documentary that I did. And so I think that was a sign that I had to complete that project, even though it took 12 years. No matter what, I was going to complete that project. And some of the pictures that was in there was pictures that my mom shot when she told me I was actually living away from New Orleans. And she said, they're tearing down the Desire project. I said, oh, no, I didn't know that. She said, well, I tell you what, I'll go. And that's who got me started taking pictures, by the way, was my mom. So she said, well, I'll go and take some pictures of it. And so those pictures was in that container that floated in the storm. So that let you know that was that was given for me to do that, to actually tell that story.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm glad that you had the opportunity to tell it. And I think, as we reflect on it and we think about the film, there are a number of parallels that we could draw to Flint. And I'm just wondering, Mona, can you share some of the work of your organization and also just kind of some of the things that have happened and are happening that really tie into some of the things that we filmed?
Sure. Well, one of the first thing that comes to my mind is the St. John's Street Memorial Park project. So in my previous role, before I was working with Environmental Transformation Movement of Flint full time, as of last year, I was with the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative at the City of Flint. So my role was to support improvements around new mixed income housing. So it's really fascinating to hear other people's experience with mixed income housing. And so in that role, I got connected with the St. John Street Historical Committee, which was rightly up in arms because the city sold the last remaining original building in the St. John neighborhood, which was destroyed due to urban renewal or urban removal, right? Urban removal is projects that were piloted in Flint as a national project, really. The mastermind behind urban renewal mentioned Flint in literally targeted our community. But and it ties back to the highways as well, as we were talking about earlier, because initially the plans for I-475 were to go through Burton, which is a first ring suburb of Flint, but it was literally rerouted to go through two Flint's only Black neighborhoods, Floral Park, and then the larger community of St. John, to displace Black residents, very, very intentionally. And, with St. John, it was similar, like environmentally, it was not the greatest place. It was near Buick City, to the east of Buick City, which was a major manufacturing site for Buicks. And we hear stories about, you couldn't leave your clothes out on the line because the soot would get on them, or if you got a car, you'd have dings in the paint from all the pollution in the air. But at the same time, when you talk to people like Mr. Wardlow, who's the president of the historical committee, Miss Ricky Gist, Brenda Waits and Brenda Fluker, Arthur Bivens, and others, they talk very much about how, very similar to Desire, their neighborhood was tight-knit. Everything they needed was there, partly because of restrictive covenants in Flint at the time. As a Black person, you literally could not, I did not know this until I worked with the group, you couldn't go, you safely go to the west side of Saginaw Street. You had to stay in St. John. And there was a similar story in the film where children had gone beyond the bounds of Desire, and the police brought them back because they were in the wrong neighborhood, right? And so you had a microcosm of the whole city in that neighborhood out of necessity, because those are the bounds where you could really travel safely. And people lost their homes. They were told in St. John, they were told, don't fix your roof. These projects are coming in. It's going to get torn down anyway. And when then it came time to value their homes, they might have spent, I've heard somebody say, like, the house might have been worth $90,000 at the time. They got $14,000. I don't know if the number is exactly correct, but the disparity in the generational wealth that they would have gotten and what was stripped from the families is profound. And I think you see that parallel. I'm bouncing over a little bit, but like with the class action lawsuit and thinking about the Flint water crisis too, right? Here, I think it's I'm trying to remember the numbers right. It was like $67 million, and more than a third of that is going to the attorneys. And then there's a very difficult process to actually validate that you have a claim, and the time period for registering for your claim has passed and is short, and relatively few residents actually participated because it seemed like a scam. And so it's set up to be an injustice, to take care of these historical wrongs. So that's just the backstory. So anyway, I got connected with the historical committee, and they were like really hurting from the fact that the community center building, which was the center of their neighborhood life, their civic life, is now a marijuana grow facility, and they've added a layer, and they've painted it white, and there's going back to the film as well, like it smacks like a real gut punch too, because of the war on drugs and how so many people were incarcerated, and now this is legalized in Michigan, and people are profiting, and it's people coming from outside of Flint coming in, right? White business owners who are able to profit off of the manufacture and sale of marijuana. I'm not saying good or bad as a social, like a personal preference, but I'm just saying as understanding systems of power and oppression and how that's enacted upon neighborhoods. It's problematic. And so the group pivoted then to putting its energy to building a full-scale memorial. And so when I was at the city, I worked with them to do a charrette and to do like a 6-month planning process, which is ongoing. And now the city has committed some ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act funds, as well as about $250,000 from the sale of the St. John building to build the memorial. But it's a huge fundraising effort. So the last remaining park in the neighborhood, West Boulevard Park, is going to get renamed the St. John Street Memorial Park. It will be reinvesting even though the houses are gone, there's still a need for healthy outdoor recreation spaces and playground. The group wants a big pavilion, just is reinvigorating this part of Flint that was taken from them. But it's also telling the stories, and so it resonated with me with the film as well, because I feel such an urgency for this particular project that we're working with the group on, because the folks who lived in St. John, they're in their 80s and 70s, and it's not going to be an act of justice to build the memorial if they don't enjoy it, right, and they don't live to see it and enjoy it with their grandkids. And then just quickly, just one other example is obviously the Ajax asphalt plant case. So this is off of Carpenter Road, right at the boundary between Flint and the first ring suburb, Genesee Township. On the Genesee Township side, there's a massive industrial park where Genesee Township has zoned almost all of its industry near Black neighborhoods, adjacent from Flint. And so there isn't that local control where we could change the zoning as Flint residents. But one of Flint's current largest public housing complex, River Park, is across the street. There are single family homes in the area that were built with HUD money. And there's a privately owned, HUD funded low-income housing complex called Ridgecrest next door to River Park. You've got thousands of families, lots of children. And you see that same dichotomy where on one hand, the families are really concerned about the health impacts on the kids. They talk about, we already have a lot of cancer. There's other industry in the area. This is an area of cumulative impact that has taken people's lives, shortened it, or taken their lives. The industrial park has other sources of pollution there. And so now Ajax wants to put a hot mix asphalt plant, and they've built it. And we had over the last couple of years, we've really pushed, and there were over 400 residents who spoke out against it. One comment in support of this siting, the EPA wrote a letter of support against it, or wrote a letter of public comment against this siting. HUD itself opposed it. The Flint Planning Commission, Flint Housing Commission, the mayor, the city council came together in a resolution. I mean, there was very strong public opposition to this siting. Like, we're not saying don't build it. And I think they're positioning for some future projects. we're saying don't build it here next to all of these families, which are predominantly Black and already have, all this other pollution on them. So we're still fighting it. The state did issue the permit with some minor changes. Ajax is suing the state to remove those changes, and we're suing the state to still try to block the permit. And we also have two civil rights complaints at the federal level through HUD and through EPA, which we're in negotiations with the EPA one right now. And then HUD, surprisingly to me, the one of the things I've learned is that they're not taking a position on zoning. They don't see it as a fair housing or a civil rights issue, which is crazy because they're the ones funding the location of the housing. The city recently got, not the city, the Flint Housing Commission applied for a Choice Neighborhoods HUD planning grant to work with the River Park residents to see, what do you want to do? The housing's not in great shape, but this is what I wanted to say. The parallel with the film is they have this community, generations of families living there. It's tight knit. And even though there are challenges and the pollution is there, those relationships help sustain you. And so it's not as simple as just like, do you relocate people? So that planning process will happen, but it was initiated because of Ajax moving in and wanting to make sure we're protecting those families. So it's going to be very important to document the stories of residents there as well. And I should say for the St. John project, the memorial project, like you said, Essence, there's an oral history aspect. The historical committee has worked with Sloan Museum and U of M Flint faculty and others to document the stories and be able to tell them. So that's tied to the memorial as well. So anyway, I could go on and on, but I think the last thing I know we're getting out of time. The last thing I want to say is that there's a real opportunity here to push these government agencies to do the right thing, not just for Flint, but for all the environmental justice communities across the country dealing with the same things. They need to understand that these are civil rights issues that are pressing and are structural, and we have to stop dealing with them on a piecemeal case. A loss, a class action lawsuit was not justice for folks in Desire or for folks in Flint. It's not a way of getting to justice. It's just, it feels like we're just being bamboozled.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Mona. Leonard, did you want to say something in response?
Yeah, the class action suit have come and gone in Desire. And of course, we still have people living on the waste dump. And, there's money allocated, but, it's not until it's in the hands of the people that it makes a difference. It could be allocated and be sitting in a bank forever and drawing interest or whatever it does. But, I think it's time for that to come to a closure, and that, if whatever it takes to move those people, because, if you put the shoe on the other foot, how would they feel to have their family members sitting, on a landfill that's been designated, has been, the Superfund site has come and gone. But we all know that there's toxins in the air. We lived close enough. I was only like 4 blocks from the landfill where we lived. And any given day, a fire would start up on the dump. So now it's in the air. If you hang, back in the day, nobody had washers and dryers. You hang your clothes on the line. So it would get in your clothes, and then now you're bringing that inside, and to give an example, my mom died because of pulmonary fibrosis, which is part of the fumes and that type stuff could have caused that. So it's so many people that I know personally that has died because of cancers. And there was not a classmate, but a bandmate that I think they stopped counting at 5 or 6 different cancers that she got. And she was a healthy person, all through high school. But then when I saw, I didn't even recognize her. So it's one of those things that, is eating up people, is killing people. And, they just can't afford to move on their own. And so now that they've allocated this money, then let's make use of it and get it out the bank and get it in the hands of the people that really need to, get out of there. And they've already allocated what they're going to do with that land. They're going to build a solar panel facility, which there won't be any people involved, so that's good.
Yeah.
But that's just sitting there too, and who knows, that might pull out, and then all of a sudden they won't have the money to do whatever. So just go ahead and make it happen is what I say.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point that the settlement has happened, right? But then there's some families that have not realized the benefits of it because there are dollars to relocate them, but it's tied up in the bank or in litigation or what have you. And then residents were compensated, but obviously it's you know
Yeah,
it's
I remember my check was $325,
yeah.
and it cost me that much to go down to get certified copies of this and that and all that. And when it was all said and done, it was what 14 million was decided upon, and it took 7 million between the attorneys and the court fees. So there was $7 million to distribute them on, I think 5,000 people, and I think like I say, I ended up with 325. I might have gotten another 200 from my parents, because they were deceased.
Mhm.
But now the people who lived on the landfill, they got 3,000, but that's not, a life is worth much more than $3,000.
Absolutely.
And it
it's
barely pays your medical bills too.
Yeah, right.
Doesn't
Yeah,
even
that don't even count.
rush to
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
yeah. I
Exactly.
mean, I think all valid points and things to think about. It sounds like a lot of money at first, right? And a lot of possibility for money. And it's not that it's about the money, right? It's
Right.
to try to achieve some level of justice or compensation for what people have been through. And
Yes.
as you said, Leonard, there's no amount of money that will compensate for the pain and the suffering that people go through.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was sort of what happened in Flint, that a lot of people felt like it wasn't even worth it because, like you said, by the time you go and get the copies and the doctor's report and spend all that effort, and you had to do some of it online, and some people don't have internet access, and there were just so many hoops to jump through for so many people, and there were multiple stages.
Yeah.
There was the initial interest which had a deadline, and then there was the full application, which that you had to be communicated to about that required thing. It was just a lot for what we all know the result will be. And if we're talking about people with, you said they stopped counting at 5 different types of cancer, things like that, at that point, does the $325 really matter, right?
Right.
This never
Right.
should have happened. And when I was reading about it, it said that there was some soil testing that happened, and there were 154 different toxins, and 50 of them could cause cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Right. There was an image that I saw of a lady. She had just moved in. She was digging for a garden, and she dug up cans and bottles and debris from the landfill. Right.
That's right.
And here she is wanting to plant vegetables. And so, the injustices are just numerous. The compensation is, dismal. But I'm grateful, right, that there was a sense of community, that there was a lot of love in the community, right? And I'm, deeply sorry that happened to your community, but also, very disheartened that it's happening, that it's happened here, that it's happening in other communities, and people are still dealing with it, which is why I'm grateful for organizations like Environmental Transformation Movement of Flint. Because I could only imagine, rallying those 400 people and getting those letters from those different agencies, right? How stressful it is, and who knows what the end result will be, right? Will there be actual action taken, or will it be, just a great effort that kind of got people all rallied up, right? Thinking, knowing that their voices matter, right? Because that part has been validated. They've been empowered. They have agency. But then also recognizing that there's more at work, and they may not get the results that they're looking for. So go ahead, Mona. I know you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say to that point, it's for me, it's been very important that as we're fighting the Ajax sighting, that we're not just thinking about it in terms of this particular one sighting, but how do we use our voices in Flint and our experience to elevate this issue of cumulative impacts is one.
Mhm.
And to inform, like the EPA right now is doing it's called an informal resolution agreement. It's a negotiated process, but they're kind of testing it out with us and some other civil rights cases where they're involving the complainants more. And so this is kind of new at the federal level. And so my hope is that we're having this broader impact around policy making to prevent this from happening to other communities, and to create better practices for our federal agencies to be accountable. And I think we do need to be always questioning government agencies at all level and
Mhm.
holding them to account for doing things the right way, and reminding them that they work for us. That's something I think that gets lost sometimes, especially in bureaucracies. It's not about just creating processes to make it easier for industry, right? This is something we see in Michigan, where the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy has become sort of a social kind of a customer service processing center. And I have to credit Nayara Sharif for saying that from Flint Rising. She's like, yeah, there's never a permit that they don't like. We have to question that. Why is that? Why are they operating the way that they're operating? So
Yeah. No, I think very, very valid point. We really need to be looking at policy level change, systems change. In those structural systems that have allowed this to happen in the past. We have some unfortunate case studies, but we have a lot that we've learned, that we know, that we have experienced, and somehow we have to translate that to those changes that prevent it from happening to our communities again, but also to other communities. So as we prepare to conclude, I want to just give space and opportunity for each of you, and we'll start with Mona first, and then we'll go with Leonard. What can we or should we learn from the film A Place Called Desire, and what should be our call to action? So Mona, we'll start with you.
That's a good one. I would say learn about zoning codes. I know it's boring. This stuff's online though. And if you have that knowledge, it does give you power to shape your neighborhoods. I think as we look at in Flint, particularly with the Choice Neighborhoods Planning Grant coming in for the River Park area, we need to make sure that the city is, or not in the city, I'm sorry, the Flint Housing Commission is, if they end up building new housing, that it be quality housing, not destined to fail. Because I think that it's easy to get the grant, and then it seems really bright and shiny to build new housing. But if it's not built to last, it's really another disservice to the community. And I think we've seen that in Flint in other ways as well, historically over time. And I think there's so much from the film to take, but I think the other thing on a personal level that I'm reminded of is, and I think Leonard, you said this earlier, like, or Essence, capture the stories of your grandparents, record them, ask them questions while you have them, your parents, your uncles, your aunties, anybody. Learn about your history while you can, because it's everything. It's everything, and then we can tell fuller stories and understand our history more fully, whether it's your family or your neighborhood.
Wow, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, that to me, I guess, is that my mission at LS3 Studios is to educate, inspire, and to entertain others, but inspire them to tell their story. And I think that when you look at a place called Desire, it's many stories in there, and even some stories that I had to leave out. But the important part of it is that these people who normally would not have had a voice to say what they thought of their community and how important their community was to their life. And I think if we, and I'm speaking more of the African American community because again, gets back to more people who tell our story. Everybody find our story intriguing, and we don't even find it that way. And until it makes to Hollywood or whatever. I don't know how many people told me, "Well, it'd be great if you could have got Tyler Perry to come and help you with the film." Well, Tyler didn't live in Desire, and I appreciate it if he came and said, "Oh, look, here's $100,000 to do this film," but it wasn't about that. It was about telling a community story that I was passionate about because I was part of it, and I wish more people would get behind the stories of their communities or their families and share those stories for the next generation, and then maybe, just maybe, this might help all the problems that we're having with the youth of today. If they had a better understanding that these people didn't just all of a sudden got this nice car or had this nice house, they worked for it. And, they had a lot of trials and tribulations that they had to deal with to get those things. But in spite of that, they still got that and they live a comfortable life. But, this generation now, I think we're not connecting with them. And I had always said that, people say, well, write a book. Well, I don't think this generation is the book group. I think we need to reach them on their level, and it has to be on the big screen. I just have a feeling that the big screen makes a difference, and that's why I'm destined to do more films about our communities and famous people that are not so famous that Hollywood will not come knocking on the door and say, I need to tell that story. So those are the people I'm looking for. And so my Miss Bush, Yvonne Bush, you're going to hear that name again because it'll be in the film festivals. That's a documentary I'm working on now. I'm working on Leading the Glory. A lot of people don't know about the Native God. Glory was a great film, and it was about the 54th in Massachusetts, but they were not the first Black group to actually fight as the United States Colored Troops. It was actually Port Hudson Group. And so nobody knows their story. And then I'm doing a story on Gulfside Assembly, which is a story. This is their 100th anniversary. And it's the story about Bishop Jones, Robert Jones, who purchased land in 1923 in Waveland, Mississippi. And it was the only place that Blacks could actually go into the Gulf of Mexico and swim. And so, it's a unique story. It's part of the Methodist Church story. And so we're commissioned to do that story. So this year we'll be completed with that because this is the 100th anniversary. And so I just want to continue telling the stories of our people. I love it. I love the research. I really love the research because I love genealogy, but that's what I wanted people to take out of a place called Desire, that those are stories that need to be told. And hopefully I inspired others to do the same for their community.
Yes. And thank you so much for creating the film and also for giving us the opportunity to show it, and then also for being willing and desirous of being with us today. I think your presence coupled with the film and the conversation that we've had has really just, brought it full circle. And I think we have a better understanding of what you were wanting to accomplish and what you did accomplish. We look forward to more great stories from you, and hopefully we can show them as part of our film series in the future. Mona, thank you for the work that you do on behalf of residents every day. And thank you for being with us and for adding to this conversation in some very meaningful and powerful ways. I want to invite everyone for our final film in this year's African American Film Series. It is on February 9th at 5:30 p.m. We get the party started. We're going to have food. We're going to have music. We have a live band. There's dancing. It's just a good time. And we start at 5:30 at the Flint Institute of Arts. And then the movie starts about 6:45, 7 o'clock. And it's called Balloon Man. So Balloon Man is the story of Bill Costin, who was drafted by the Buffalo Bills. He wanted to play football. His dream came to an end, and he decided to go from the turf to the air, and he became the first African American hot air balloon master pilot in the world. So we will learn about his story. The other thing that's really cool is we've got a special trip planned for the summer. We'll be inviting all of the attendees at that film and also the community to join us in either Frankenmuth or Holly. We haven't decided which one, for a hot air balloon festival. And hopefully we can provide some, special opportunities there as part of our Culture Shock program. So thank you all for joining us, to everybody who listened live and everybody who is listening to the playback. We are glad that you had the opportunity to hear about this story, to learn more about community, and to be challenged in your day-to-day life to learn the stories of your community, tell the stories of your community, capture the stories of your community, but also to be champions for change. So with that, I say good afternoon to you all and goodbye. And again, thank you, Leonard, and thank you, Mona, for being with us.
Thank you for
Thank
having me.
you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Nice meeting you, Mona.
Nice to meet you. And I love the document. And I love the documentary.